And now we have some breaking details. We were trying to pull confirmation before the newscast, and we have it on the IRS scandal and its targeting of conservative Americans. The Associated Press is now reporting an IRS supervisor based in Washington, D.C. admits she personally scrutinized Tea Party groups. What that means for the top IRS officials who claimed this was just the work of so-called rogue agents at their office in Cincinnati. We're gathering the information. We'll get our producer from D.C. who's working the story there now. Stay close. All right, so now the story is beginning to come together, developing inside the Fox report, breaking new details on the scandal surrounding the Internal Revenue Service and its targeting of conservative groups. A woman by the name of Holly Paz, a former IRS supervisor based in Washington, D.C., says she was personally involved in scrutinizing some of the earliest applications from Tea Party groups seeking tax-exempt status. Now, she would be the highest-ranking IRS official with knowledge of the targeting thus far to cooperate with a congressional investigation. We knew she had spoken to the House Oversight Committee Chairman Darrell Issa of California and bipartisan committee staffers on May 21st. Now we're learning exactly what she said. We want to get that from Chad Pergram, who is our Fox News senior Capitol Hill producer, on the phone with us now. Chad, what details are we learning?
Well, what's interesting here that we're learning from about Holly Paz is that, she was in Washington, D.C. and looking over, some of these applications, and that she handled these applications for tax-exempt status, and that she had looked at 20 to 30 of these applications at the very early going in this situation. And what's interesting is that this conceivably, if you're to believe what Holly Paz has to say, this puts this in Washington, D.C. There's been a lot of back and forth over who was to blame, whether these were, quote, rogue agents in Cincinnati. A couple of weeks ago, I looked at some of the partial transcripts from two Cincinnati employees that they gave in interviews with congressional investigators, Gary Muthert and Elizabeth Hoffaker. They said that Lois Lerner, this was the other IRS official in charge of the tax-exempt division here, she tried to pin this on Cincinnati, and when they saw this, they viewed that as a nuclear strike on this. Paz, in her interviews with congressional investigators, say that dozens of Tea Party applications sat for a year, and they were waiting for guidance. So again, bringing this, again, if you're to believe what Holly Paz says, closer to D.C., that's what's key here, that this was just not something that was emanating out of Cincinnati. I asked it. Go ahead.
I'm looking at some of the information that is coming up with this, and my question would be, has she given any evidence or any information that senior IRS officials ordered agents to target conservative groups, and where that order would have come from?
Well,
exactly.
That's what everybody is looking at here. How far up the food chain this potentially went. Paz says that some of these applications sat for more than a year. And in the interviews with Elizabeth Hoffaker, the employee back in Cincinnati, she said she would get calls from these folks asking about the status of their applications for tax-exempt status, and we're getting no answers whatsoever. So you had these applications sort of sitting in limbo, this sort of fiscal netherworld between whether or not they were going to get tax-exempt status or not. And Elizabeth Hoffaker said a long time ago, she said that's not fair to them, and that's the inherent problem with this story, is that people just didn't know where they stand, they couldn't get information, and that they were targeting these groups.
Yeah, there are two things that are interesting to me, Chad, as I'm reading this coming across the Associated Press wires and of course via our own reporting tonight. The term Tea Party was really the operative phrase.
Yes, that was something they were looking at. They also looked at Patriot, 912. There were some of these 912 groups out there.
There were some others, but according to this Paz, former IRS supervisor based in Washington, Tea Party was really what she was keying in on. And we've heard from those groups saying that they felt like they were languishing, waiting for some word back from the IRS on their tax-exempt status. It's different when you actually hear it coming from the source now.
And when you look at some of the depositions that were given by Gary Muthert and Elizabeth Hoffaker, the Cincinnati employees, they had sort of developed, for lack of a better term, an algorithm that looked at how that they, adjudicated anybody that came in with TEA, just those initials. There was even some debate whether or not that was narrow enough, because then they were coming up with teachers. So you're going to have this fight back and forth as to who knew what when in Cincinnati or in Washington, D.C. Steny Hoyer, the minority whip in the House of Representatives, he commented this week when he was asked about this. He said, well, you could understand in Cincinnati why they would be defensive about this. But, again, if you're to believe, Holly Paz, some of this, washes up in Washington.
Well, and one of the things she seems to talk about is the fact that they were looking at politics in this. She says that they were looking at all groups, but not all groups would have the name Tea Party in their title.
Certainly, and that was one of the biggest issues, too, in some of these other transcripts I looked at a couple of weeks ago, is that it was clear that there were certain groups that were getting more scrutiny and that there were other groups that came in. In fact, the deposition from Elizabeth Hoffaker in Cincinnati said that they would get applications from progressive or liberal groups, and that there wasn't any sort of adjudication for them that that went to the same level of scrutiny that they were giving to the Tea Party groups.
You know, Chad, maybe there's no immediate answer to this question, but for people watching, it's almost like this is an onion and we've gotten to maybe layer 3 and there are 393 layers to go. You wonder how much more we will learn. Is this somewhat of a smoking gun, or telegraph this out for us?
Well, I think the fact that it might draw it closer to Washington, D.C., and maybe from, Command Central there, that could potentially be important there, that this, there's more and more evidence that this might not have originated completely and lived completely in Cincinnati, that this was more of a Washington, D.C. issue. If it was more of a Washington, D.C. issue, that goes to the, command structure of the IRS, and that's what people have been suspect of, for some time now. But, they're continuing to hear from these different, IRS officials taking these depositions behind closed doors. We still don't know the status of what Darrell Issa, the chair of the House Oversight Committee, what he wants to do with Lois Lerner. She remains under subpoena, and they have left open the possibility of calling her back. In the meantime, there's a big shoving match back and forth between Darrell Issa and Elijah Cummings, Democrat from Maryland, the top Democrat on the Oversight Committee, about this. And they're saying, look, Cummings has been upset at some of these different portions of transcripts which have come out in the press from these interviews. And Cummings has threatened to, release all of it if possible. And we don't know where that's going to stand.
Chad Pergram, this is breaking on a Sunday night. I know you will continue reporting. We'll come back to you as the news warrants tonight. Fascinating detail now, turn of developments in the IRS scandal, with a more senior advisor giving us information tonight on the targeting of conservative Americans. Chad, thank you. We'll be right back. Stay with us.